The countryside air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The villa, nestled among lush greenery, exuded an old-world charm. She found herself captivated by its serenity, a stark contrast to her otherwise bustling life in the city. Her husband had been distant lately, his work consuming most of his attention, leaving her yearning for companionship. She hoped this retreat would offer a chance to reconnect, but as the days went by, his focus remained on his laptop, not her. It was during one of those moments of solitude that she first truly noticed him, her father-in-law. He was a quiet man, his demeanor composed yet enigmatic. The lines on his face spoke of a life lived with restraint, and his eyes held a depth that unnerved her. She had always thought of him as a distant figure, courteous but aloof. Yet, there was something in the way he moved, deliberate and measured, that hinted at a man more complex than he appeared. One afternoon, as they sat on the veranda, he spoke of his late wife. His voice carried a tenderness she had never associated with him before. "She loved this place," he said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It's strange how a house can feel empty, even when it's full of people." His words lingered, settling in the air between them. She nodded, unsure how to respond, sensing a vulnerability he rarely displayed. Later that day, she wandered to the outdoor bath. It was secluded, surrounded by tall bamboo that swayed gently in the breeze. The sun filtered through the leaves, casting dappled patterns on the ground. She slipped into the warm water, closing her eyes as the tension melted from her body. This was her sanctuary, a place where she could forget the growing chasm in her marriage, if only for a while. Unbeknownst to her, he had followed. At first, it seemed unintentional, a coincidence, perhaps. He lingered at the edge of the clearing, his presence silent but palpable. When she opened her eyes and saw him, she startled, her breath catching. "I didn't mean to disturb you," he said, his tone apologetic yet steady. He held out a towel, his eyes never leaving hers. Her instinct was to retreat, to cover herself, but something in his gaze rooted her in place. It wasn't lustful, it was something deeper, more disarming. "You should be careful," he said, a faint smile touching his lips. "The evenings can get chilly." She took the towel, her fingers brushing against his briefly, the contact sending a jolt through her. As he turned to leave, she found herself watching him, her emotions a confusing swirl of discomfort and intrigue. For the first time, she saw him not as a distant patriarch but as a man, complex, flawed, and undeniably human. She sank back into the water, her mind racing, unable to shake the feeling that something had shifted between them. The water rippled gently around her as she leaned back, letting her thoughts drift. She had hoped this trip would bring her closer to her husband, but it seemed to have only deepened the distance. Alone in the secluded bath, surrounded by the soft rustle of leaves, she tried to let the tranquility wash over her. The warm water soothed her body, but her mind remained restless, tangled in emotions she couldn't quite name. The faint crunch of footsteps broke the silence. She turned her head sharply, startled to see him standing just beyond the bamboo. He hesitated as if unsure whether to step forward, but then he did, his movements deliberate. "I didn't mean to intrude," he said softly, his voice low enough to blend with the wind. Her initial shock gave way to an uneasy tension. She clutched the edge of the bath, her heart pounding as she tried to gauge his intentions. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her voice firmer than she felt. He nodded, his expression unreadable. "I was just walking. I heard the water." There was a pause, and then he added, almost as an afterthought, "It reminded me of her. My wife used to love this spot." The mention of his late wife disarmed her slightly, but the tension lingered. He stepped closer, stopping just at the edge of the bath. The proximity felt intimate, uncomfortably so, but she didn't move. His eyes lingered on her, not in a way that felt overtly inappropriate, but with an intensity that made her skin prickle. You remind me of her sometimes, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The way you carry yourself, it's familiar. She didn't know how to respond. The vulnerability in his tone was unexpected, but it didn't erase the unease coiling in her stomach. She reached for the towel draped over a nearby rock, her movements slow and deliberate. I should go, she said, avoiding his gaze. As she stood, wrapping the towel around herself, he didn't move. Instead, his hand brushed hers briefly, a fleeting touch that felt heavier than it should have. You don't have to, he murmured, the words hanging in the air between them. Her breath caught, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She looked up at him, searching for something in his expression that might explain what was happening. But his face was calm, almost unreadable, save for the flicker of something she couldn't name in his eyes. I need to go, she said again, her voice faltering. She stepped past him, her heart racing, her mind a storm of conflicting emotions. As she walked away, she could feel his gaze following her, heavy and unrelenting. She didn't look back, but the moment stayed with her, seared into her memory, leaving her questioning not just his intentions, but her own feelings as well. The days that followed were fraught with an unbearable tension. She avoided him as much as she could, her movements around the villa becoming calculated and cautious. The weight of what had happened, or what could have happened, clung to her, making it difficult to breathe. She told herself it was nothing, a misunderstanding, an innocent moment blown out of proportion in her mind. But the memory of his touch, the quiet intensity in his eyes, refused to fade. Her husband, oblivious to the turmoil brewing within her, continued to bury himself in his work. His laptop and phone seemed more deserving of his attention than she was, leaving her to navigate the growing unease alone. She found herself questioning everything, her marriage, her sense of self, and, most troubling of all, her feelings toward the man who had disrupted her carefully constructed world. At dinner, the silence between her and her father-in-law was deafening. He acted as though nothing had changed, his demeanor calm and composed. But she could feel it, an undercurrent of something unspoken passing between them. Every time their eyes met, it felt like a secret they were both unwilling to acknowledge. She tried to act normal, focusing on the mundane details of the day, but her voice betrayed her, trembling slightly under the strain. It was late one evening when he finally approached her. She was alone in the living room, staring blankly at a book she wasn't reading. The soft shuffle of his footsteps announced his presence, and she tensed, her fingers gripping the edges of the book tightly. I wanted to apologize, he said, his voice low and steady. She looked up at him, her expression guarded. For the other day, he continued. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. She wanted to tell him it was fine, to brush it off and move past it. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she found herself saying, I don't know what to think.